Hello and welcome to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, Director of Advanced Media Production at Cal State Long Beach. Today we're going to be talking about communication in the age of cyberspace. My guest today is Dr. Ebony Utley. Dr. Utley is an Associate Professor of Communication Studies. Welcome, Ebony, and thank you for joining us on Talking Points.
Thanks for having me, Dave.
Well, we're having a conversation about communication, but it also happens to be occurring in front of multiple television cameras, lots of lights. We're going to upload this to YouTube for video on demand viewing worldwide. So technology certainly has changed the game in terms of communication over the last few centuries. Centuries? I should say decades. But if we were talking about communication a century ago, it would be a lot different. We'd be talking about a face-to-face kind of interaction or sending mail and then waiting a week or more for a response. So we can acknowledge from the outset that technology is wonderful. It's allowed us to have this instantaneous communication worldwide. We can use Skype and see the other person who's talking to us from another continent. All of that is wonderful. But there are some other things that we need to talk about that maybe show us that there are some drawbacks to this. And I think you've identified one of those, which is you've referred to as growing up tethered. So what does growing up tethered actually mean, and what do we need to be concerned about in that area?
Essentially, it means we have less solitary time, less time to be alone with our thoughts. So let's say, for example, that I was going through a breakup. Instead of deciding how I really felt about that breakup, I would just mass text all my girlfriends and see how they felt about the breakup, and then their feelings might become my feelings. So I didn't have time to actually process. I just let other people process for me. The same thing with, there are a lot of websites and apps now, anonymous sites, where you can ask questions to the crowd. You can crowdsource your feelings, like how should I feel about this, and strangers will tell you how they would feel. I mean, we see the same thing with lots of think pieces, right? Something drops and then there are instantaneously, everyone's got an opinion about it. I'm like, okay, think pieces are great, but that's not theory building. So instead of thinking about how we feel about the new movie or the new book, instead we go online and see how other people feel. Oh yeah, that sounds right. That's going to be my feeling too. So there's less time to think about our feelings. And then the flip side of that is that we think about helicopter parents, right? The parents that are hovering around their children, but we also have children that are tethered to their parents via their cell phones and technology. So when you encounter a problem in your 12-year-old life, instead of actually trying to figure it out on your own, you could just call mom and dad. And because they're your parents, they're always going to pick up the phone and they give you the advice that you need instead of you figuring out yourself. So that process of growing up tethered, not thinking for yourself because your friends can do it for you or your parents can do it for you, is really starting to delay the maturity of our young people.
And when we talk about telephones, and everyone seems to have a cell phone or a smartphone today, telephone technology has been around since, well, in common use since probably the 1930s, but it certainly has changed with the smartphone now that we have instant access. I remember in the old days, even I'm still remembering the days when a long-distance call was a big deal. The family would gather around the phone and wait for a relative to call, or maybe we would be generating the call. And it was an event. And those days are gone, and that's probably a good thing. It's better to have instant access. Another thing that's improved is that we don't have to carry around a pocket full of change to use a payphone. We can just pull out the cell phone and use that. That's another good development. But these digital devices and this idea of being tethered, as you've just described, does mean that we tend to allow a lot more intrusions or digital intrusions into our life with the cell phone. Are we letting the cell phones and the smartphones control our lives to a large extent?
Here's the irony about being tethered, right? So on the one hand, we're tethered more, but on the other hand, we're less tethered because we don't have to make appointments anymore. Like I can see you on Skype, so we don't have to meet face to face. Like I don't have to be home at 8 p.m. to watch my favorite television show. I can watch it online or I can DVR it now. I don't have to wait for that long distance call. I could just take it wherever I am. So the technology that tethers us also makes us less tethered in some ways. And for me, that's really exciting to be able to make appointments in different ways, but not having to be someplace at a set time, at a set place for a set interaction. But I would say that it is a huge intrusion in our lives and problematic when two things happen. One, when you have withdrawal symptoms when you're not with your technology. Like if you just freak out and panic and hyperventilate, that's a problem. Also, if it's causing conflict with your loved ones, if your people are complaining that they can't ever get your attention or you're never focusing on them, or if you're using your technology to track down your loved ones and complain because they're not where they're supposed to be at a certain time, or they said they were going to text you and they didn't text you back, if it's causing conflict in your interpersonal relationships, then that's when your technology is definitely becoming too intrusive in your life.
And speaking of causing conflict in interpersonal relationships, there have been a series of recent studies tracking social media where they try to get surveys of people that use a lot of social media and to determine what kind of effect this is having on people in society. And I've got a study here that I brought in from actually a series of studies that are summarized in a publication called Psych Central, and this was written by Marissa Maldonado. And in the summary of these surveys, she says, the impact of social media on society has prompted researchers to investigate whether its effect is positive or negative. The findings are mixed, showing both benefits and downsides to the use of social media sites. One area of focus in these studies is the effect of social media on mental health. And she goes on to say, recent research has shown that using social networking sites, namely Facebook, can increase people's stress levels, produce anxiety, and negatively affect a person's sense of self. One or two other quick quotes here, and then I'll get your response. Another study showed that Facebook increases people's anxiety levels by making them feel inadequate and generating excess worry and stress. And additionally, 2/3 had difficulty sleeping due to anxiety and other negative emotions after they had used the sites. Apparently, one of the issues here is that people are looking at Facebook and they're seeing that all of their friends or the people that they're connected to are having all these wonderful experiences. They're having lots of fun, lots of accomplishments. They're posting on the site. And here I am looking at it and I'm saying, old boring me, I never do anything fun. I never have these accomplishments that I can post. What's wrong with me? Why am I so inadequate? What's your reaction to that?
Yes. As in, yes, like all of those things do happen to some people. They happen to many of us at different points in our lives when we're going through different things. I mean, yes, like social media can cause you anxiety because you have a window now that you wouldn't have had before into hundreds, sometimes thousands of other people's lives that are constructed to look more fabulous than yours. And sometimes social media is a race to who can construct the most exciting life. But I also think dealing with that is a maturity thing, right? It's like, you know, I remember high school and it was kind of a place where like if you weren't the cool kid, then you had anxiety about like not fitting in and maybe the other kids bullied you. And your mother would say, well, other people's opinion of you is not your problem, right? You shouldn't worry about those things. Like you're smart and successful and you'll be great in life. And I think that we just need to reach a new maturity stage when it comes to using social media. I think because it's so new, I mean, most of us are really like maybe 6, 7 years old when it comes to using social media. At the most, we're 10 or 11 years old, so none of us are teenagers yet. So we're still kids on social media thinking about like other people's lives being more exciting than ours because that's how kids process. So I think the more that we grow up with social media as a society, the more mature we'll become and the better we'll be at discerning what's real and what's fake and whose opinions matter and whose opinions don't.
And in addition to the anxiety that I referenced in that question and that you've addressed, there's also this concern that people are becoming increasingly bored in society. And what do we mean by bored? It means that they're feeling unstimulated, that they want more activity, they want to be more stimulated. And the reason is because they've become used to this world of constant entertainment, certainly different from what it was, 50 to 100 years ago when we didn't have all of these technological devices, all of these movie theaters, all of these video on demand opportunities, the video game consoles, and those sorts of things. And there's another author, a psychologist by the name of Dr. Sandy Mann from England. She's a professor and also a consultant. And she wrote an article recently titled, "Why Are We So Bored?" And she mentions in the article that despite the plethora of high-intensity entertainment constantly at our disposal, we are still bored. Up to half of us are often bored at home or at school, while more than 2/3 of us are chronically bored at work. And if I can go on here for just a moment, she says, the irony is that while our mobile devices should allow us to fill every moment, our means of obtaining that entertainment has become so repetitive and routine that it's a source of boredom in itself. What do you think about that?
I like to distinguish between boredom and laziness.
Okay.
I mean, I think that being bored is Perhaps a choice, because if boredom is defined by wanting to be stimulated and the lack of that stimulation, well, stimulation just doesn't drop in your lap. You have to go get it, whether you have the technology or not. If you want competitiveness, then you have to play a sport and join a team. If you want to learn a new skill, you have to go out and learn it. And the internet is still a great place to network and to learn new skills and to do all of these things. But if you're too lazy to go get it, then that's something that's on you, right? It's not necessarily because of the technology. So I think people who say that they are bored are probably reluctant to admit that they're just a little lazy about chasing new stimulation, whether that's inside the tech world or whether that's outside of it.
Right, and I think that one of her solutions at the end is not to be so reliant on technology to provide that kind of stimulation. You need to develop other kinds of skills and talents, such as painting on a canvas or cooking new kinds of foods and talking to people, exercising, things like that.
But I think all of those stimulations can also come like through technology. You can learn new exercises by watching YouTube videos, right? Or you can learn things about art history by exploring museums online or using augmented reality to do so. So I mean, yes, by all means, like get outside, breathe fresh air. But if that's not something that you're into, you also have the alternative of exploring these new things through some sort of technological mediation.
So it's not just the technology.
It's not just the technology.
Okay,
Yeah.
Very good. Well, there is one other issue that I'd like to talk about that is of some concern, and that is, you mentioned it in one of your previous answers about people not spending enough time to process their feelings before sending out information. And oftentimes we see this with people who will send out some kind of a notice on Facebook or send out a tweet or reply to an article they read in an online news column, and they'll respond emotionally to something they read. It's the passion of the moment. And in the old days, when you had to write a letter to the editor, you would take the time to actually write and compose the letter on a typewriter or something, and maybe in the course of that time you might rethink some of your emotions, you might cool down a bit before you mail it, and you may even decide to tear up that letter and throw it away because really that was just the passion of the moment. But we don't seem to have that self-restraint anymore with the internet and this instant access. Do people need to maybe exercise a little more self-restraint when they're responding to things like that?
I mean, I think that goes along with my maturity answer, right? The more we grow up with this technology, the wiser we'll become in how to use it. But on the flip side, I like to say that internet access is like having money, right? It just brings out who you really are. So if you're a mean girl and a hothead, like you're probably going to be a mean person and a hothead on the internet too, right? That's just kind of your personality and who you're going to be. So I think also we should pay more attention to sort of civic training and becoming better citizens and better people in general, and then that will impact how we interact with each other online.
And on that note, we're going to have to go to the break. And stay with us. When we come back, we'll talk more about communication in the age of cyberspace. Stay tuned.
How do you present a good image of a Hollywood star that just got arrested last night? That's the job of a public relations firm. Or as a media specialist, you may suggest new approaches for promoting an idea or product. This degree will prove an invaluable asset for anything it is that you do. You can become a part of this exciting field with a degree from Cal State Long Beach.
Welcome back to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, Director of Advanced Media Production at Cal State Long Beach, and my guest today is Dr. Ebony Utley. And Ebony, before we went to the break, we were talking about people needing to exercise more self-restraint, perhaps, the maturity factor that you've brought up a couple of times, which I think is really important. The tools will only take us as far as our maturity level will take us, I guess, would be another way of saying that, and I think that's a really good observation. Let's talk now about the fact that the internet is so pervasive now, and that's a good thing. It's not necessarily a bad thing because it makes life so much easier for us. We can do our banking from our smartphone if we desire. We can find out all kinds of tips on car repairs. We can watch a YouTube video to actually show us how to replace that old carburetor in that 68 Camaro if that's what we want to do. We can find out about medical tips, where the great restaurants are, what are our travel options if we want to change flights for an upcoming trip, what about the weather report, and all those kinds of things. So it's here to stay, and it's been a great tool. However, people need to also realize that if they're using all the search engines and all the search tools, they're also leaving a bit of a profile on the internet. And that can be problematic if you're a little too free with information or if you're not protecting vital information. And there are some things that people need to know about. What should people be thinking about as they're using the internet?
I always say there's nothing private that's on the internet. Like once it's on the internet, it could potentially go any and everywhere. So don't share anything or put anything up that you couldn't explain. Right? So I always tell my students, I'm like, you know, if you're planning a career in politics and that baby picture of you shows up in the bathtub, you just say that you've been keeping it clean since 1985, right? But if you can't come up with a story, right, or a rationale for why you did what you did, then you should probably think twice about posting it. And as you grow up and mature, it's a good idea to go back and clean up some things that no longer need to be there. Like always, I encourage my students with Twitter in particular, things that are the things that start out being very public, to be very careful about what you post. And even things like Snapchat. I'm like, it's on a server somewhere. We just don't know where. So pay attention to those things. Pay attention to what browsers you use. It's a good idea to clear cache. It's a good idea to clear your cookies once in a while, because every time you go to a site, they're starting to track you a little bit. Maybe you have an alias that you like to use for your junk mail, and maybe you use the address of your job as opposed to your home address. So that's not the first thing that comes up when someone reverse looks up your phone number. That's also something that happens. And there's a great book called How to Disappear that tells you how to disappear. But even if you're not into disappearing, it has really good advice for how to protect your identity online. Just don't check it out from the library or buy it online, because then they'll track you.
And we've been hearing that employers always check social media before they hire someone. What about that?
Yeah, and I think they should, quite frankly. I mean, it's public information. If you're not careful about what you post, then your employer needs to know that you're the kind of person that isn't very careful about what you say in public. So not only do employers check, but professors check too, as quiet as it's kept. I mean, you claim you were at a funeral over the weekend, but I searched you on Facebook and that's not what your picture said. So it leaves a digital trail, and you would be surprised who follows, but people are following and paying attention. So just be careful about what you post. And sometimes this is what I do. I'll type something out and status and a post and then delete it. And I feel better about that. It's kind of like I posted it, but then it's never going to be public and no one's ever going to see it. But I went through the process that I need to go to pretend like I was sharing, and sometimes that also helps.
So it sounds like discretion is always the better choice.
Key. Yes.
Okay, well, let's talk about the internet in society today and the fact that you really have to participate in the internet in order to be a meaningful participant in society. I mean, that's just the way it is. And it's never going back. We are where we are, and it's only going to go forward. So as a society, are we as internet literate or digitally literate as we should be? And what do we need to do for the rest of society, the majority of society? Because obviously there are some people that are very, very tech-oriented, but a lot of us aren't. So what do we need to do as a society to bring everybody up to a level of sophistication so that they can use the internet in the quote-unquote right way?
Society needs digital literacy. We teach critical media literacy in college, and back in the day it was called computer literacy, just basically showing you how to use a PC. But now we need digital literacy. We need to know how to use the phones, and we need to know how to use the tablets, and we need to know how important it is to upgrade regularly so that you're not vulnerable to different hacking and different diseases that come through with your phones. Like Heartbleed happened a couple years ago and most people had no idea what that was. So it's important to know like how hacking happens and how to protect yourself and protect your devices. If you have a device that has a camera on it, know that you could be spied on through your camera. So maybe it's something you want to cover at night before you go to bed or engage in private activities. If you have an Echo from Amazon, like maybe you don't want it on all of the time, listening to all of your conversations. And then you need to know the most efficient ways to find information. Like anyone can find information online, but finding it efficiently requires skill and it requires practice. And once you find that information and know the best search engines to use and know the right keywords to use, then you have to learn how to evaluate that information, like which websites are legitimate websites and who owns what websites and how might that perspective affect how you receive the information. And then once you've got the information, then you need to know how to disseminate it properly. Which social media sites would be the best place for this information? Is this a public display that you want, or is it private information that you want to share? And then what's the etiquette for sharing that information? Should you put a comment on it? Should you just share it without additional information? Do you use a hashtag? Do you not? Which hashtags are popular? Which ones are going to be most useful if you've got an organization that you're trying to promote? Which ones are going to garner the most attention for your social justice mission? I mean, all of these things are part of digital literacy. So it's not just like turning it on, but after you turn it on, what happens after that?
And we're going to have to accept that there's always the potential for mischief with hackers, and certainly in the area of cyber crime. And so that's going to be with us. It's the double-edged sword. We now have the ability for people in remote villages all over the world to get access to information that decades ago wouldn't have been possible. But along with that comes this universal global connectivity where the bad guys, quote unquote, are out there and they're always looking for an opportunity. What do you think about what we should be doing in addition to what you've already said about being concerned about hackers and cyberspace being invaded? What can I do to check on where I'm at? Are there tools that I can use to see if I'm being tampered with online in a cyber context?
Yeah, I mean, there are a few things that you can download in particular to protect your devices and to check your usage and make sure you're only using a Wi-Fi that you can log into and that you're familiar with. Some people go as far as virtual private networks. Some people go as far as using Tor sites and anonymous sites on the web to protect themselves. But I think just like we have emergency preparedness for natural disasters, we should have emergency preparedness for cyber terrorism as well. Like, what happens if cyber terrorists attack the power grid? Like, I have not received a message from FEMA. Like, I don't know what we're supposed to do in that sort of situation, but I think that like our governmental leaders should be more responsible for telling us that these things could happen and here's how we protect ourselves. I mean, the Sony incident was mostly embarrassing, right? But if that had been a more malicious attack, what would we do as citizens of the United States? Like, what do you do if you can't get internet access to your bank accounts? Do you need to have hard copies of that information? Do you need to have special like Bitcoin blockchains to access or codes to access your information? Like, what should we do? And I think those are huge questions that we haven't even begun to answer, but we need to start getting ahead of it as opposed to always playing catch up and waiting for something bad to happen. What if we started making plans in case something did happen?
And that leads nicely into the next question, which is about the government and the government as a regulatory agency and also as a bureaucracy. And I know that you're interested in developing new applications for the digital sphere. Is the government, and maybe it's a mixed bag, but is the government a helpful intercessor when it comes to regulation and bureaucracy, or do they often hinder new developments and new startups?
Institutions are the enemy of innovation. That's why so many of our greatest innovations happened in garages, right? A couple of people got together, they had some ideas and they built them. And so everyone has ideas. So the ideas that really matter are the ones that get executed. And the way to execute is to do it quickly, to build the thing and see what happens. So books like The Lean Startup or books like Sprint are suggesting that if you've got this new idea, you build it, you put it in front of people, you get feedback, you build it again, you put it in front of more people, you iterate and reiterate. And that's the fastest way to get to a good idea that's been executed and appeals to its target audience. Now the government is like, okay, you build an idea and then it'll go into our pipeline and then it'll be someone's responsibility to evaluate it and maybe they'll get back to you in 6 to 9 months and then we have to check on our funding and then it goes to the second person that needs to evaluate it and then it gets hung because there was some government crisis and we never got back to it and then we don't need the thing anymore, right? There's a lot of red tape that has to happen. Instead, we just really need to cut some of that, even if we just use smaller markets or smaller states or smaller cities to test the thing, see what happens, see what people do with it, and then do it again. But the government and institutions in general are constantly getting in the way of that process, and that's my biggest frustration.
Well, there are a number of leaders in the tech world sort of carrying on with this theme, a number of leaders in the tech world who are now actually concerned that artificial intelligence is actually getting away from us. In other words, it's expanding and evolving so rapidly that it poses a danger to humankind down the line. Bill Gates, Elon Musk, a couple of the folks that have expressed these concerns. What do you think? Are you concerned about artificial intelligence and its rapid pace of evolution? And is there a danger that computers will one day outpace humans?
Technophobia is not really my thing. You know, people fear things that they don't understand, and I'm more interested in educating. Like, let's find out more about it. So the singularity keeps getting pushed back. I mean, no, undoubtedly it will occur, right? But we keep pushing it back a little bit at a time. So we have a ways to go, and we've got a lot of time to prepare. So right now, I'm just really happy to say, okay, Google, and have it talk back to me, right? Between Google and Siri, I'm kind of good, right, on the AI, and I think most people are. But what concerns me most is when these technological developments happen, who's going to have access to them, right? Is it just people that already have money, power, and access access to resources, and what happens to the rest of us when that gap grows increasingly larger? The people that do have control over the AI, like, are they going to become like techno-colonialists? Are they going to use it as a weapon of power in places that don't have access to that sort of technology? So that's what concerns me more than the AI taking over humans. I want to know what humans are going to do with it to increase the hierarchies among other humans.
Well, since we're talking about education and preparing our future citizens in the population, students, you have students in your courses. What do you advise them to do in terms of becoming prepared for the tech world that they're going to be looking for jobs in and they're going to be navigating through when they graduate? What's your best advice?
Okay, so two things. The first thing I tell them is that if you're using something free online, then you're the product that's being sold, right? So it's your data. You have access to it. You should make choices about what people can and cannot do with it. So read the terms and conditions. It's really important. You don't know what you're signing up for or where your data might be one day in the future that you're not prepared to explain. So I think it's very important that we think about that. And I also tell my students, you need some skills, right? We could teach you theory and concepts and analysis all day, but you actually need to put it together into skill building. And that's what I try to do in my classes. We're going to design websites, and we're going to practice social media, and we're going to practice pitching, and we're going to network in the community, so that you can leave my class saying that you have those skills. You can put those things on your resume and walk right into a job having had some of that experience.
We have about 15 seconds left, so if you can answer this in 15 seconds or less, you deserve an award. But are the kids in the younger grades, before they get to college, are they being prepared properly for the future?
No, they're not. And particularly young children of color, because they're not being taught that they can be innovators. When we see innovators, they don't look like people of color. Most of them look like young white men. And a lot of my students get to me saying, I didn't think I could do this. I didn't think I could be an innovator. I didn't think I could think or create in this way. And that's because no one ever told them they could all the way up the pipeline. So if we can do anything, we need to go to those little kids and tell them, like, yes, you can build, and let me show you how.
And on that positive note, we'll have to bring the program to a close. But thank you so much for being here and sharing your ideas with us. And thank you for joining us on this edition of Talking Points. Join us again soon for another episode. Until then, I'm Dave Kelly. Have a nice day.